Hi, welcome to Chad's Silversmithing. Today I wanted to talk about a common problem that beginners have, and that is accidentally melting their projects. And I wanted to show you 5 potential reasons that's happening to you if you're having that problem. So um, before we get started though, I'd like to thank you for watching first of all, and ask you if you find this video useful and enjoyable, if you'd hit the like button and maybe subscribe to my channel. So with that being said, let's get started with those reasons that you might be melting your project. So I found when I was a beginner that I oftentimes had problems with getting the piece too hot and melting part of it, or even melting the whole thing occasionally. And I wanted to point out a few things that people can do to prevent that from happening, as well as some common causes. And even at the end I'll give you a few tips on using the torch a little more efficiently and effectively. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the list of reasons that you might be melting your project. And the first and foremost is that people have a tendency with silver to focus in one spot when they're beginners with the heat. And because silver is the way it is, when you're heating a piece of silver, the entire piece needs to be heated up to the temperature that the solder flows at. And if you focus just in one spot, the part that's away from where you're pointing it has a tendency to act as a radiator, bleeding off excess heat, and so you have a hard time getting the entire piece up to temperature, and the solder will not flow very well. So the trick to dealing with that is to constantly keep your torch moving over the piece and making sure that the entire piece is going up in temperature about the same rate and reaching that melting temperature of the solder at about the same time. That has a tendency to prevent it from melting so often. Second thing is getting distracted. When you're using a torch and you're focusing on a piece and you're working on it, oftentimes you're focused on the piece of, like say my piece of solder is right over here. I'd be focused, I get the whole thing pretty hot, and then I start focusing there because I think I'm close to the temperature to get that to flow, and it's not quite there, so it just sits there and doesn't flow. And while I'm doing that, this part over here is acting as a way for heat to bleed off of the piece, and so I'll get this little portion of it too hot while this portion doesn't get hot enough, and so that piece of solder never really quite flows and the wires start melting. And that's one of the more common ways that I used to screw up when I first started, is I would get distracted and I just kind of focus on this part and not pay attention to what's going on over here, and that causes some problems. So third, a big issue with some people is they don't flux enough. Okay, and when you flux your metal, you want to make sure that enough flux stays on there while you're drying it to where it gets crusty and forms a white coating on the surface. What that does is that prevents the silver from oxidizing and reoxidizing quickly under the heat, because solder doesn't really like to stick to silver oxide. And so if you prevent it from getting silver oxide on the surface with the flux, then it sticks really well to it. If you don't flux it, or say you have a piece of solder right here, and this side got fluxed enough but this side didn't. So when you get the solder to flow, it'll jump onto the side where the flux is, but it won't really attach to this side over here. And so when they're doing that, they continue to focus and focus and focus, trying to get that to jump that gap over there. Although if there's a gap, it won't. It needs to be touching. But they focus too much in that spot, and then they melt this little spot here because the rest of it's acting as the radiator and bleeding off the heat. So fourth, one of the things that happens a lot of times is if you're taking a real long time to heat up your piece, which people at the beginning have a tendency to do because they hold their torch too far away because they're nervous about melting it, so they just generally are basting the piece with heat, which will gradually start oxidizing things, including the solder, which, if you're like me, you flux it first and then you put the solder on, and so the solder has no protection to keep it from oxidizing. So while you're heating it for a really long time, that solder will gradually form a silver oxide on the surface, and that makes it harder and harder for that solder to flow. So if you get it too oxidized, oftentimes people, in cranking up the heat then at that point, after they've basted it with heat for a long time, causing that to oxidize, will then go ahead and melt their piece because the solder just won't flow at the temperatures it used to. Okay? Finally, and this is one of those things that I'll demonstrate in a second here. I'll demonstrate a couple of these things. If you have a huge disparity in the mass of things that you're going to solder together, that oftentimes people try to heat the entire piece at the same rate, but if you have a little tiny piece and a great big piece here, if you're heating them at the same speed, the little piece will reach that soldering temperature very quickly. The big piece takes a lot longer to absorb enough heat to get up to that temperature. So it's just a time thing, really. And the way to avoid having that problem happen is to focus most of the heat on the bigger piece until it is almost to the temperature, and then focus over the entire piece to get it to flow. So there it is. Okay. So first, I got a bunch of little pieces of scrap wire over here that I found on the table. Okay, let's do the focusing the heat in one spot first and see what happens. Okay, so beginners oftentimes don't realize you have to heat the entire piece. So they just see that piece of solder and they're like, oh, okay, I'm going to melt that. Let me go ahead and flux it for this one. Okay, so let's just focus right there and see what happens. See how the solder's balling up on top? Not really sticking very well. It did, but it was getting real close to melting these wires before it even ran. And I'm not 100% sure that that'll actually be a good strong solder joint. So see that kind of thing going. But you see how shiny the wires are getting? So let's do one over here with no flux and see what happens. This time I'm heating the entire piece like you're supposed to. Let's see what happens. See, it's flowing, but it's not really doing the normal adherence thing to the metal like it normally wants to. It's kind of clumpy. And if you have it fluxed, it'll flow nicely into a puddle. Right now it's just kind of forming a clumpy glob there that sort of sticks them together, and not very well. Okay? So that's an example of that. Let's put a piece of solder on a piece of sheet and see what happens here. Put a little bigger piece of solder. Now what I'm going to do on this one is I'm going to hold the torch a little bit too far back. And I think you'll see as I do this, the solder will start to get black. Can you see how black that solder is turning? As you do that, it makes it harder and harder to get that solder to flow. It seems to raise the temperature that it will melt at. So oftentimes people have trouble getting that to flow well, and then they cause too much heat to be in one spot and it causes a melting point. So that is oftentimes the case. But you see how black it's turning compared to the fluxed area around it? That makes it a little bit harder to get it to flow. Okay. So this, I'm going to put this over a little bit here. I'm going to put this great big freeform casting. It's called a bean casting. And then we're going to put a jump ring here. There's a lot less mass than that thing. And we're going to act like we're going to attach it right here. So we'll flux it. And let's see, I'm going to cut a another little biggish piece of solder. So again, the problem with sometimes with these kind of issues is this thing weighs 10 times what that little ring does, and so it's going to take quite a bit longer to get that up to temperature. Now if you're heating the entire piece equally, like this, the ring will probably reach temperature before that big chunk of metal ever does. You see the solder will start to melt here, but because that big piece hasn't reached temperature yet, it's going to probably just jump onto the ring mostly and not really stick to that big piece. And if people just focus there trying to get that chunk of solder to flow, you'll see what will happen is a lot of times that ring will just melt. Okay, because I haven't gotten this piece hot enough yet. So you see how shiny that ring is, and it starts to get squishy and melty. So if I really want it to stick on something big like that without melting part of it, I got to spend way more time on the bigger chunk here. And then at the very end, see how it's getting kind of a reddish glow to that whole big chunk? Then go back and focus where the two come together. I don't know if you can see that. I'll zoom in on the edit on this one so you can see, but it immediately flowed and stuck to the big piece instead of starting to melt that ring like it was doing earlier when I was not getting this piece hot enough. So, alright, so those are the main reasons that people have melting issues usually. A couple of pieces of advice about using torches and using the flame as efficiently as possible. Probably have talked about this in the past in some of my videos, but the hottest part of the flame of your torch, whether it's this kind of torch or an acetylene torch or whatever, they usually have a blue cone like this. And the blue cone, the tip of that blue cone is the hottest part of the flame. So if you want to get things to flow quickly and efficiently, you want to keep that that tip of that blue flame right above the metal. Okay, and a lot of times, like I said, people hold it way too far back because they're afraid of melting things, and so it just oxidizes things really badly and never brings the thing up to temperature. Or they hold it way too close like this, which creates a situation where you're squishing that blue cone into the pad and not using the heat as efficiently as possible, so it's hard to get it to reach temperature. Okay? Another thing I see people doing a lot at the beginning is you tell them to keep it moving over the whole piece the entire time, which is good advice, but what they do, instead of doing that, they kind of go like this, big long sweeps, or around the outside like this. So, and that's not really keeping the heat on the metal for very long, and so it has trouble ever reaching temperature, and so it'll just get darker and darker and darker like this, and get harder and harder to get it to solder. So that is an issue sometimes. A good rule of thumb when you're soldering stuff is if it's taking more than about 30 or 40 seconds to get your solder to flow, you should probably stop for a second, set your torch down, think about what is causing the problem and why it's not flowing, because that's typically about how long it should take to get it to flow. So there's a number of things you can do. One, maybe your torch is too low, you don't have enough flame. And one of the things I was going to talk about in here too is that if you're using one of these little plumber's torches, as they get older, the flame starts becoming less consistent, and so when you turn it upside down, it may either get smaller or bigger, even though it seems stable when you had it upright like this. So it's best to adjust its flame to where you want it to be while it's upside down. It'll be a little more consistent that way. So, and back to what I was talking about, if it takes more than 30 or 40 seconds to get it to flow, you got to evaluate. Am I doing that sweep thing where it's not keeping the heat on it long enough? Is my flame too small? If it is, I can turn it up a little bit. Maybe that's the problem. Did I flux it well enough? Am I heating the entire piece? Am I focusing just in one spot? Because that's bad usually. Okay. So those things are important to keep in mind. And when you're a beginner, it's hard to keep track of all of those different things at once until your brain develops little scripts to do them automatically. I don't have to think much about how far away I have the torch anymore like I used to, because I just do it kind of automatically because I've done it so long. After you do this for a year or so, you'll start to just automatically know some of these things and do them without thinking. And it makes soldering seem way easier. So Don't get too discouraged if you're having a little trouble at first. Practice some more and just keep trying. You'll start to figure out the little tricks like that. Okay? So things to remember: flux well, figure out how far away your torch is, make sure the flame is adjusted, heat the entire piece, make sure that the flame is continually focused on the metal at a level that's pretty close to the tip of the torch, otherwise you're going to have to take too long to get it up to temperature. And finally, if you're soldering a couple of things together that are disparate in mass, one is way bigger than the other, it's super easy to melt the smaller piece because it takes a lot longer to get the big piece up to temperature. So I hope that this has been useful and helps you to have that happen a few less times than it has happened. So, but either way, don't give up. Keep trying. Keep practicing. It gets easier as it goes, and as those things become automatic, you don't have to think about 5 different things at once while you're doing it. So, all right, that's what I had to say today. Okay, well, I hope you found that useful and informative, and it'll help you to prevent you from melting your projects. If you did find it useful, would you please consider hitting the like button as well as subscribing to my channel? And if you really think it was useful, maybe share it with some of your friends. So I wanted to thank you for watching, and I wanted to also thank all the people who've been putting in nice comments as well as the constructive criticism. I appreciate that kind of stuff. So thanks again, and happy silversmithing. See you next time.